Hello and welcome to another 140k Imperial Guard Tactics video, and today guys I am super excited to be bringing you another tournament report video. Last time I talked about running my Pure Infantry Guard at a competitive one-day event, and this time I'm going to be talking about running my pure Ministorum Tempestor Scions army. Okay, almost pure. I did take a little bit of Auxilia and a little bit of Navy units in there, so forgive me, but my primarily strong Ministorum Tempestor Scions list that I took to another competitive one-day event. Now, before I go any further, I want to say a huge thank you to the tournament organisers. The event was organised by the Northern Warlords. It's actually the club that I'm part of. It's my local scene, and the event was hosted by Element Games, and those of you who have been around the Warhammer 40k block, you will have heard about Element Games. They sponsor loads of YouTubers, they do loads of really cool stuff, they've got a really impressive Warhammer store, fantastic venue, and it was really good. So massive thank you to the tournament organisers for putting together a great event, and massive thank you to Element Games for hosting us. In terms of giving a bit more detail about the tournament, it was actually originally meant to be a 2-day event, but because of UK COVID restrictions not lifting when they were meant to and are staying sort of partially lifted, the event was able to go ahead, but it had to be a one-day event instead. That's absolutely fine. You know, big props to Matt and Stu for being able to adapt on the fly and, you know, organise everything so well. And big thank you to Element Games, because the service there was great. Table service was fantastic. You know, there is a certain standard that's now applied to, or expected of venues and tournament organisers. You know, you expect the terrain to be good, and it was, and we'll be getting onto that a little bit later. And you expect the venue to provide a bit of better service. You know, I would definitely say, just, you know, hot take, the Warhammer 40k competitive scene really seems to be maturing. And you seem to have less of these one-day events, which is Johnny Rambo's local scene that one or two competitive people turn up to and smash. And now everyone turns up, brings their A game, and you don't get any of this sort of cliqueiness. It's just good. So I do really think that it seems like the 140k competitive scene is really maturing and standardising, and that's only a good thing. So we'll see if that continues as I go to more and more events. I've got another one lined up for August. I've basically got one a month every month just going forward, which should be, you know, good. Great opportunity to do more videos. Yeah, one other thing I want to mention, just the format of this tournament, then we'll get to stuff that you guys are really here for, list analysis, games, all that kind of stuff. It was really interesting because it was because of the COVID restrictions, we were put into pools. So rather than it being a normal tournament format where you don't know who you're going to face off against, everyone, once all lists had been submitted and all players had been confirmed, everyone was put into groups of about 6, and you would only play people in your group of 6. And you would only play on a certain number of tables. Now, I was actually in a group of 4, which meant that I was playing 3 games. I was guaranteed to play one of each other person in my pool, which meant there was no way that I could avoid playing any tough lists. I had to face everyone in my pool. And let me tell you, I faced Admech, I faced Sisters, and I faced a really interesting Tyranid list. So, strong, you know, and by a very experienced player, and we'll get into more on the Tyranid list later. But so I knew going into this tournament that I was going to be facing 3 tough games, and there was no way I could submarine. And submarine, for those that don't know, is where you lose your first game, but then you win the next like 3 or 4 games, so you pop back up and you somehow end up podiuming and stuff like that, or placing really high. So I couldn't avoid anything. I couldn't dog, dutch, dip, dive, and dodge anything. I had to basically take on the hard lists in my pool because I just had to. So that was really interesting. And one last thing to mention is the way that the points were done for rankings in this event was not done on just win-loss and then total points scored in game. It was actually done on point differential. So you scored tournament points, and the amount you scored was basically based on how much you beat your opponent. So if you got like 50 points and your opponent, if you got like 60 points and your opponent got like 50 points, you would only end up getting like 10 out of 20 tournament points. So to get a 20-0 or max score, you basically had to absolutely demolish your opponent. So that's to give you an idea of the format. Points differential is a bit of an old school way of doing things, and it's actually something that I haven't seen since 8th edition, since sort of, yeah, early 8th edition, mid 8th edition, so kind of interesting there. But we'll get into that a little bit at the end of the video and talk about how that affected rankings and whatnot. But without further ado, let's get into, that's the tournament overview, that's the venue overview, and that is the format of the event completed. Now let's get into, firstly, my list, and then we'll talk about the terrain and my first games and stuff like that. So I've been playing a few pictures in the background whilst I've been talking about my list, so you guys can get an idea of what I took, but I'm going to go into more detail now. Now I have actually done a video on this list previously, and I will put a link to that video down in the description below, and that is a longer video which goes into much more depth and discusses why I took what I took. But for those of you that don't want to watch the full video, there'll also be a text shorthand format of my list down in the description below as well, so you can either read it or you can watch it. But what I took, guys, was 2 battalions, and everything was Lambdan Lions. Now, I also took a bit of Auxilia, a bit of Navy, but what I took in the first attachment was 6 squads of Scions, and every single squad had 2 plasma guns and a plasma pistol. I then had 2 Tempestor Primes in that attachment as well for the HQ. That's made of my first battalion, and there were 3 Taurox Primes as well. Now this is a very classic, I would say, core of my Scions. It's all Lambdan Lions, so all those Taurox Primes which have got Gatling gun and double Hotshot volley gun, they're kicking out huge volumes of fire, a decent AP to great AP, decent strength at strength 4. They really provide the volume of fire that my list needs, and thanks to being Lambdan Lions, the Gatling gun is AP -1. Which is great for countering, 3-up save infantry with storm shields, because you kick them back onto that 3-up. And they've also got the volley guns, which are strength 4 but AP -3, which means any infantry that you come across pretty much in the game, you're going to be kicking them onto like a 4+ invulnerable save, which is what you'll find most people are running at tournaments. There's a lot of invulnerable saves out there. Lambdan Lions, volley guns, and just Lambdan Lions in general pretty much guarantee for you to kick your opponent down onto their invulnerable save. And that's so important because most invulnerable saves are 4+ now. And it's not so scary taking on some of the top armies when they've only got a 50-50 chance of making pretty much any save that you're going to make them take at best. So that's why I took Lambdan Lions. That's why, and that's what this attachment does. It's all plasma, it's all volley guns, and it's still got volume of fire and horde clearance in those Dakar Primes. Now, for those 2 Tempestor Primes that I mentioned, they all have command rods, and one of them simply has the relic, the auto relic with Tiberius, which allows him to potentially do 3 orders instead of 2. That's a Scion-specific relic from the main guard codex. And the other one is the quintessential, the classic Lambdan Lions Tempestor. He's got Key to the Armory. That's a full 6-inch bubble of reroll 1s to hit. Because guard don't have any core or any keywords like that at the moment, it affects my Taurox Primes as well as my infantry. He also has the Refractor Field Generator relic, which means again in a 6-inch bubble, everyone is getting a 5 invulnerable save. So that's really, really good. It's fantastic. Which means that basically those 2 primes run along behind the Tauroxes, and they provide the Tauroxes with reroll 1s to hit. They provide the Tauroxes with 5 invulnerable save. When the hatches come down and the infantry starts spilling out, the infantry's got reroll 1s to hit as well, which means you can then do other orders on them, like bring it down, or elimination protocol sanctioned, or first one, 5. That's what you need to do, and you still get your reroll 1s, so you're overcharging your plasma. Basically, that combo allows me to get overcharged plasma with like some form of reroll to hit and form of rerolls to wound. It's absolutely fantastic. The other part of the other detachment is the air wing. It's my flyboys, and this is where I take 2 Valkyries, multi-laser, multiple rocket pods, and I do spring for the heavy bolters. I like the heavy bolters, especially now that they're damage 2. It doesn't always matter against a lot of armies, but without the heavy bolters, I really find the Valkyries don't bring it. Yes, they are cheaper, but they don't feel worth 120 points. But when you take the heavy bolters, they do feel worth 150 points. And it, again, adds that volume of fire. You know, each one of those Valkyries is on average putting out, I believe, 14 or 15 shots. So, you know, that's 16 shots, sorry. You get 7 from the rocket pods, 6 from the heavy bolts, and 3 from the multi-lasers. So again, a lot of that's AP -1. Between all my vehicles are doing is providing anti-horde, which is really, really good. And of course, transportation. Now, in my Valkyries, I put the Melta guns, and I have a big 10-man squad with 4 Melta. Of course, every squad has a free plasma pistol. And in the Valkyrie with the 10-man Melta squad goes the Lord Commissar, and he has the Master of Command Warlord trait, which allows him to issue an order, just one order. So previously when I've run this list, I've actually run I've run all my squads of 5-man squads. But I kept realising that my Commissar, he can only issue 1 squad. So whilst I was getting an extra free plasma pistol by running two 5-man squads, I actually figured it was better to take 1 10-man squad, lose 1 plasma pistol on the sergeant, but give all 4 Melta guns, all 4 an order, like, you know, bring it down or take aim. And I had to say, on reflection from this event, that was totally worth it. Totally worth it. Yeah, that's the way I would run it going forward. It's just better to have reliability on those Melta guns. The plasma pistol, you know, it's not the main factor in that squad. I then run 2 more 5-man squads of Melta. 1 double Melta, yeah, both double Melta and a plasma pistol, and they go in the other Valkyrie, and they go in there with my 3rd and final Tempestor Prime, which is the 4th HQ for the 2 battalions. And that Tempestor Prime has no upgrades. He just has a command rod. He has no relics or warlord traits. That's what I mean by upgrades. And he just orders those 2 squads. And also, what will sometimes happen is I will put the Inquisitor in that Valkyrie as well, and he can fly forward, and you know, he can start smiting things and doing some great stuff. So speaking of the Inquisitor, just rounding off some of the other little bits in the list, I took a double Smite Inquisitor. For those that don't know what that is, it's basically you take an Inquisitor, you go Malleus, you spend a CP on him to give him a Warlord trait, you give him the Psychic Mastery Warlord trait, allows him to cast 2 powers a turn, and you can cast Smite, and you can also cast Castigation. Now, I actually think it's funnier calling it Castration, just because then you can say, I'm going to castrate you! But, yeah, it's called Castigation. So, and Castigation is like a targeted smite. It's got, you know, some rules behind it, but it's basically another way of doing mortal wounds. And it's a really good source for 60 points. That's how much it costs. 60 points is just having a character that can just put out 2 lots of D3 mortal wounds. Now, he also knows a 3rd psychic power, and I went for, and I can't remember the name of it now, but it's the one that gives you a 5+ invulnerable save on 1 unit. To be honest, I only used it once, and it didn't really pay off. So he was basically double smiting the whole time. That's why I don't really remember that other power. And last but certainly not least, I took a Bullgryn Bomb. So this was the only part of the list that wasn't basically, you know, pure Scions. This was Ministorum Auxilia, Auxilia Militarum, whatever. It was auxiliary forces. Now they don't benefit from the Lambdan Lions trait. The Valkyries don't benefit from the Lambdan Lions trait because they're Aeronautica Imperialis. They're the Navy, basically. And the reason I take the Bullgryns is because I want to be able to operate in every single phase, and I want to be able to operate, you know, well. So there are several models out there now. You've got Ghazghkull, but more importantly, you've got things like the Void Dragon, which is a pretty common unit to come across in tournaments, who can only take a certain number of wounds per phase. So you need to be able to operate in every phase, and so that's why my Scions can do the shooting part. But I want to be able to deal with some mortal wounds in the psychic phase, hence why I have a double Smite Inquisitor. And I also want to be able to Barney in the combat phase. And that's why I take a big block of Bullgryns. And they never let you down. They are really, really good. I do have one funny thing to say about the Bullgryns though, one sort of interesting thing, which is they're really, really good until you come across an army like Admech or like Drukhari, and then they suddenly just become not that good. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but basically, you know, when I'm talking about end of game and what would I, you know, end of tournament, what would I do differently? But yeah, that's basically, yeah, the Bullgryns are really interesting. it's almost like they're really, really strong until they just come across a top tier army, and then they're nothing. But that's all the tournament and list stuff that I want to talk about. Now, what I want to do is move on to talking about the games themselves and how the Scions performed. So without further ado, let's go in to Game 1 and what the terrain was like at this event. So Game 1 was against the new Sisters of Battle. That's right, we came right up against a new, hard 9th edition army straight off the presses and ready to rock my world. Now, I have played Sisters, the new Sisters, Bloody Rose Sisters like these ones were. I played a very similar list to this in a practice game with my Pure Infantry Guard, and I got utterly stomped. It was just brutal. But that was a very, very good game for me to have because it let me learn some harsh lessons. And I was ready for Sisters in this game. And what I realised is that they can slingshot some units forward, you know, like, and repent you, and then you have to deal with them. And whilst they're doing that, they march up their other slower yet tankier units and start occupying the mid-board. And it's a nightmare. So what you have to do is not give them that chance to slingshot. You have to keep the Sisters at arm's length. And that was my game plan going into this Game 1. Now, a quick mention about terrain. It was very, very good. It was what I would describe as very meta. So lots of line of sight blocking walls in both deployment zones. So you can see that was my previous picture was my deployment zone. Now you can see my opponent's deployment zone. He had, again, big bits of line of sight blocking. And then there were line of sight blocking in both corners, in the center of the board, and also those big brown circles you can see on the table were craters. So there's a lot of terrain in the middle of this board. There's a lot. All the boards were super terrain heavy and super, super consistent. Now, whilst the terrain here isn't the prettiest, it's totally and utterly functional and works really, really well. So big props to the tournament organisers for having what I would consider to be proper 9th edition tournament terrain. It was very, very good. But anyway, let's get into that first game. So, my opponent's list was all melee all the way. It was super aggressive Bloody Rose. Now, what he had was basically 2 of all the sort of combat-y units. So we had 2 blocks of Repentia, 2 blocks of Zephyrim. They're the jump pack guys, jump pack ladies with power swords. And then 2 blocks of the new Sacrosancts, who are nasty. He also had a couple of 2 or 3 units of 5-man sister squads for doing objectives. He had a big 20 woman sister block, big 20 unit one, which, you know, he can put transhuman on, or the equivalent thereof, which makes them really tough. He had a random mortar fire just for running around and doing some objectives, and he had Moran Val. He had the big Sisters of Battle Mega HQ unit. So those were the armies, and that was my game plan. Now let's actually talk about what happened in the game. So I deployed further back, and the mission was Vital Intelligence. And I realised that I actually really had the manoeuvrability advantage on these Sisters of Battle. And I was mech'd up. And so they didn't really have a huge amount of long-range firepower. And even so, I still deployed out of line of sight because what little long-range firepower they had, I didn't want to give them free shots. So I sort of deployed out of line of sight, and I ended up winning the roll-off. And I realised, okay, you know what I want to do? I want to resist the temptation to fly my Valkyries straight down the enemy's throat and precision drop Melta. I want to avoid doing that because there's no advantage to me doing it. If I go too close to him, he'll just Zephyr him out, and those 10 people Zephyrin squads can easily jump out and murder a Valkyrie. Easily. They've got like 5 attacks each, strength 4. The big HQ person can put like some kind of crazy full rerolls on them. They're insane if you let them get to you. So what I did was I just went, you know what? I'm going to fly the Valkyrie down the flank where there isn't any of those jumpy people. And the other one, I'm going to fly down that way as well. I'm just going to fly them both away from the... And even though I took engage, it's like I don't need to get full engage every turn at this point. I'll just go in 3 table quarters. So I move one of my Tauroxes just into 1 table quarters. I move the Valkyries down, and then basically I started unloading. And turn 1, I basically killed one of the Repentius squads. It had a couple left, and he did bring some back eventually. Because he did have loads of support characters. He had all the support characters, Dogmatus, Hospitaller, all that kind of stuff. But turn 1 was subdued. I took some points. Took 2 objectives. I rodded in my own table quarter, in one of the other table quarters, not my own, and I killed some Repentia, and that was it. And then my opponent, turn 1, he kind of like boiled forth. All this is start coming out of the ruins, and he starts making a strong play for sort of getting close to the middle of the board. But there's craters and stuff, so his movement is a bit reduced, and he doesn't get great advance rolls, just average. And he has no way of getting a turn 1 charge. I had just denied him a way of getting a turn 1 charge, which frustrated him greatly, because he can't just sit back. He has to come forward to get charges off. But I don't have to let him. I don't have to be super aggressive. I can be cagey. And so that's what I did. And so he essentially comes forward in his turn 1, does no damage really. He does shoot with Val, but I save it on the refractor field, which is great. And then it comes back to me, and it's like, oh, and what he did do is he brought forward his big 20-man sister squad and sat them in the middle of the board and was like, transhuman, these guys are just gonna absorb everything. And I was like, okay. And so I thought, you know what? I'm not actually bothered about winning or losing games in this tournament. I actually just want to see what these new sisters can do. And I thought, you know what? Let's see how much firepower it takes to kill one of these 20 people blocks, these 20 battle sister blocks. And so I brought into position. My Valkyries hovered and pulled back slightly. By hovering, they got +1 to hit from roving gunship. So now my whole army's hitting on 3s. I brought the Taurox Primes forward. I get my infantry in the Valkyries out and ready to provide fire support, and the Bullgryns move forward, and basically, I thought I'll probably kill about half with all my firepower, and the Bullgryns can finish it off. And what I realised is that the internet has been very wrong about those 20 people blocks of sisters, because they genuinely aren't that tough to kill. So even with putting my opponent had transhuman, he had a feel no pain on them, he had a good invulnerable save on them via various sources. Even with that, my 3 Taurox Primes opened up and basically single-handedly deleted that squad. Basically single-handedly, because I had all the volley guns, all with reroll 1s. And all, which was basically knocking him onto, I think he had a 5 invulnerable save, knocked him straight onto that, 24 volley guns, knocked him straight onto that. And then I had 60 shots, which even though he was in cover with some of his sisters, not with all of them, and I always shot the volley guns first, which helped trim off the people in cover. So when it got to basically the 3rd Taurox, there was no sisters in cover. And I was like, okay, so here comes the Gatling gun now. Because obviously all the Gatling guns have been fine, but the 3rd Gatling gun really did work. Because this is on a 4-up save. And so I think there was like 5 left when the dust settled. And I was like, oh, there's actually nothing for my Bullgryns to charge here. And I just finished them off with the Valkyries. And it was like, oh. So I've just stayed, number one, I've stayed far away from the sisters again, so they're not going to get a good charge off on me against any of my firepower units. I've just deleted their main objective holding unit. I've already decimated their one of their combat squads, and I was really lucky because in I should have said in turn 1, in turn 2. My Valkyries did, my infantry finished off the remaining sisters from the big block side, and my Valkyries did fantastically and killed all of the Zephyrim. My opponent was a little unlucky But 10-man squads, I've got blast weapons. You know, it meant I was fine. You know, and I'm hitting on 3s. So, and you know, they're not transhuman. Those Zephyrim aren't transhuman. So I'm hitting on 3s, wounding on 3s. I'm putting them on to basically a 4-up save. Volume of fire, you know, I just killed them. It was fine. So, you know, obviously I think there was like 1 left, 1 or 2 left, but they just ran away. Yeah, so it was pretty crazy. So it's like end of turn 2, I've killed 2 combat units and my opponent's main objective holding unit. And the Sacrosancts are still not really very far forward. And the only thing that Sacrosancts really, and the Repentia that were on the board had left to really fight was the Bullgryns. I'd thrown the Bullgryns forward and I was like, if you want to charge Bullgryns, that's fine. Because I don't mind my Bullgryns dying if it means you're then left in the middle of the table facing down all my firepower. And bear in mind, I hadn't committed any of my plasma squads at this point. Unfortunately, my opponent is a combat army. And so he can't really sit there and not charge me. So he proceeds to charge forward. And he, you know, one of the Sacrosant blobs goes after the Valkyrie infantry. Fair enough, they kill all the Valkyrie infantry. The other Sacrosant blob ends up going into like the bull. Goes into the bull. No, it doesn't go into the Bullgryns. Don't make their charge. That's important. And so the Repentia go into the Bullgryns with the characters, but the Repentia kind of got a bit of a bad charge, and so they didn't actually. But when the dust settled, I'd only lost 4 Bullgryn against the Repentia, and in return, the Bullgryn, there's 5 Bullgryn there with a priest, just beat the crap out of the Repentia, absolutely toasted them. And then it was a bunch of characters who are strength 3. You know, yeah, they've got power swords, but whatever. Trying to fight a bunch of Bullgryn, and you know, I just killed his characters over the course of the rest of the combat. I just stayed in combat. I didn't care about shooting his characters, and so my opponent was in a tough matchup. And so basically, his Sacrosancts, one of the Sacrosanct squads is exposed on a flank, the other one is exposed in the middle, and the hatches come down, and the plasma infantry comes out. And in one turn, I delete both the Sacrosant blobs. Essentially, I think there's like 1 or 2 left, but yeah, and that was it. At that point, my opponent had lost his Repentia. He had lost all the Sacrosants. He had lost. There had been some flank skirmishing between some of my 5-man Scion, like my 5-man Barebones squad and Volley Gun squad. They'd dropped down. They'd done some flanking and some skirmishing, and so basically at the end of turn 3, turn 4, my opponent had a handful of models left, and so we played it out. And by the end of the game, my opponent had, I think, like a five sisters, a Sacrosant here and there, and then Val died in the last turn. It was brutal, and I still had probably 30 infantry, 3 Taurox Primes, and my Valkyries. So I still had a good 1,000 points knocking around. So it was a brutal massacre, and because it was vital intelligence and you had to hold 2 objectives to get 5 points, and I just kept denying my opponent the ability to do that, and my opponent was very slow. The score was something like, I think it was 93 to me, because I was just smashing the primary because of my manoeuvrability. I was smashed all my secondaries. I took no prisoners, because my opponent had loads of infantry. I took, which I got like 9 points for that, I think it was. And then I took Rod, which I maxed, and I took Engage, which I maxed. I think I might have dropped 1 point. So overall, I dropped 3 points from Rod, 6 points, and 6 points for Engage. And that was it. And sorry, 6 points for no prisoners, and I maxed everything. And then I dropped 1 point for Engage, sorry. So I did end up getting 90 points, I believe. Something like that. 99 1 points. And my opponent got something like 37 points. Like, yeah, it was brutal, because he couldn't achieve his secondaries because I kept killing all his manoeuvrable units. And he took the same secondaries as me. and he did get a couple of rods off, but he didn't have any deep strike. I kept zoning out his deep striker, so he couldn't run his reserves, because he did drop some reserves in and whatnot. So yeah, my opponent, it was basically 40 points to my opponent, 90 points to me roughly. Brutal game. So Sisters, not a problem for Scions. And if I was to sum it up, it was basically a case of Sisters brought a knife to a gunfight. It was kind of realistic. If a bunch of people turn up with knives and shields, swords and shields, and another bunch of people turn up with guns and tanks or vehicles and air power, it's going to go one way. And that's basically what happened. So I was super proud of that performance, because I had faced that exact same list and been almost tabled by it when I used my pure infantry. So the Scions, there was such a hard counter to the Sisters list, simply because I had the maneuverability to never let the Sisters get near me. If I didn't want to, they wouldn't. Every time they tried pushing forward, I just moved Taurox 14 inches in another direction. I just moved my Valkyries back a bit. I basically did like the horns of the buffalo, where I had the flanks and I had my backfield, and my opponent was just wallowing in the centre, and there's not much he could do about it. So that was the first game. Victory for the Scions. But the next game wouldn't be so easy. The next game I had to take on the new top dog, the new bogeyman, or boogeyman. I had to take on Adeptus Mechanicus. So let's get into that list now. So my second opponent, I should have said for my first opponent, in fact all my opponents this tournament were absolutely fantastic. And I actually had never met my first opponent before, but I have met my second opponent, an absolutely fantastic player called Ash. Last time we crossed swords, I had Gene Silical, and he still had Adeptus Mechanicus. So, you know, he's been running these guys for a while. Fair play to him. Yeah, last time I beat him. So this was certainly a bit of a grudge match, this one. Very much a friendly grudge match, I should say. But all my opponents were fantastic this tournament. All of them. All of them were great. And Ash had Admech. He had Lucius. He had a lot of Skitarii. And he had a lot of planes. Now, in case anyone's wondering around painting, I should have mentioned, if you see unpainted models in this tournament, there was actually, that's okay, because there's actually no painting requirements for this tournament, and that was because of some of the last minute changes with pods and pools and COVID restrictions and things just being uncertain whether the event was even going to go ahead at all, and the organisers decided they wanted to make it a little bit more fun, and just, if people wanted to bring whatever they wanted to, they could do so. There was no painting score, although of course there was always personal honour, and so I made sure that my army was painted, because I promised the YouTube people, my great and fantastic loyal subscribers, that I would have a fully painted army. So there we go. But anyway, back to the matter at hand. Admech. So Ash's list was 3 big blocks of Skitarii, 3 of the new bombers, 2 squads of raiders, 2 squads of infiltrators, and 6 last chickens, and all the buff characters you could want. You know, you had the Marshal, the Manipulus, you had it all. First thing that stood out to me was the amount of stuff that the Admech could turn up with. I mean, when it was the Sisters and versus Scions, it was, you know, my opponent had taken all infantry, but, like, and he outnumbered me, but it didn't seem, like, overwhelming. The Admech had taken loads of vehicles, you know, 9 vehicles from the chickens and the planes, but still turned up with like 100 bodies. So it definitely felt like my opponent had a lot of assets to lean on, and his deployment zone was like chocker, it was filled, whereas mine was very much not filled. So read into that what you will. And I did say that to my opponent, because, you know, I knew Ash. I was like chatting with him. I was like, wow, you've got a lot of stuff. Are you sure you're not running an 8th edition army? And he was like, it feels like I'm running an 8th edition army with the amount of stuff I'm able to turn up with. So fair play, you know, this guy wasn't trying to downplay Admech. He knew he was turning up with a list that was ready to, you know, ready to Barney. Now, I was on a different table this time, and there was less line of sight blocking terrain, but more dense terrain. But I knew that Admech didn't really care about dense terrain, because they have access to loads of sources like +1 to hit and whatnot. And I hadn't faced new Admech before, and reading about an army and knowing that they're tough and facing an army is just different. And I basically decided I had two choices. I played it cagey in the last game. I kind of wanted to stress that, so I'd already got a win under my belt. And I was a bit like, you know what, I've got a win, so I'm not going to get whitewashed. Maybe I could play a bit of a riskier strategy. And I thought, you know what I could do? I could really go into my opponent and try and hit him hard turn one. Because I deployed cagey, but I won the roll off to go first. And I was like, you know what? I could play it cagey and try and play the long game. And maybe, you know, wait for some opportunities to appear and whatnot. But then I was like, you know what? If I've got turn one, I could fly in there. I could drive up there. I could do as much damage as possible. And maybe weaken the admech to the point where actually we'll have a bit of a game. And so I went balls to the wall, guys. I'm not going to lie. I went all in, you know. I flew the Valkyries in. I precision dropped the Melta out. I started blasting. The Tauroxes moved up. And I thought, you know what, this Lambdan Lion extra AP, surely that can counter the Lucius defensive buffs. I mean, yeah, I know they're on like a one-up save or something crazy because of how they work. But surely I can counter the defensive buffs with my additional AP. That was not the case. And it turned out to be the entirely wrong decision to make. And I'm sorry, guys. I wish I could bring you a more exciting summary of this game, but I basically, you know, hold my hands up, and you've got to learn from these things, and hopefully you will learn from my mistake. I lost that game turn one, and I went first, and it was entirely my own fault because it was me being unfamiliar with admech. I thought they could sit in that defensive doctrine. I didn't realise they couldn't sit in it. And so I flew forward, did as much damage as possible, and once the Gatling guns had stopped chattering, and the volley guns had stopped shrieking, and the missiles had stopped firing, the end result was very little damage done. Very little damage done. I think to be fair, I had killed his raiders and his infiltrators, but I had killed, and I'd done some good damage, like I'd done a bit of damage to his Skitarii. But due to screening and movement and whatnot, I hadn't been able to target his heavy hitters really. And they admech hit back. And, you know, probably poor, you know, again, mistake from my end, poor target acquisition, target choice from me. But I was really trying to play the objective game. I was really trying to deny, I thought, just deal with all my opponent's maneuverability and then I can start winning on points and stuff. No. The admech have got the equivalent of a Dark Matter Crystal. The Veil of Shadows, they can just teleport around. Admittedly, they could just do it once, but still. Again, I wasn't aware of that. I wasn't aware of what that could do. I thought Solar Flare was like a defensive buff, but that I didn't ask my opponent. That wasn't his fault. It's a flare, right? I thought it would make me less able to hit him. But anyway, long story short, guys, I flew in. I didn't do anywhere as much damage. And my opponent, in return, he blew away one of my Valkyries. He annihilated the Melta infantry, essentially. He killed two of my Taurox Primes. He killed the contents of those Taurox Primes. And the bombers, wow. Now, if I could just say, everyone's going on about the Skitarii. The bombers are the real broken thing in that dex. Truly, like even more so, because they literally have the best bombs in the world in the game. So normally with bombs, and this is very much maybe an 8th edition mindset, and please correct me if my perspective on this is wrong. I'm totally willing to hold my hands up and say this is wrong. But my experience with bombs in the past, when the few times I've faced them in 8th edition and whatnot, is that there are roughly speaking, two kinds of bombs in 40k. You either got to roll a dice, you fly over the unit, you drop a bomb, and you can do this every turn. And either you roll a dice per model in the unit up to a maximum of 10, and on 6s you do a mortal wound. Or you roll one dice on maybe a 3+ or a 4+, you'll do D3 mortal wounds. And if it's like a one-off bomb, it'll be like D6 mortal wounds or something. You know, something like that. You know, that's kind of the thing. With AdMech, they get a dice per model in the unit up to a maximum of 10. But the more wound thing goes off on a 4+. So they get literally the best of both worlds. And then you're not even protected if you're vehicles. Because against vehicles they get an automatic 6 dice. So what happened? And all you need to do is be lucky on those 4-ups, right? So my opponent just flew, you know, he flew over these planes over my Bullgryn blob and just killed 5 of them in one turn. Just got lucky on 4-ups and just killed 5 Bullgryn. There's nothing I could do about it. And what was really interesting is if he hadn't done that with his planes, the Bullgryn would have been a huge factor in that game. Because later on, when there was like 3 Bullgryns left, he fired a full block of Skitarii Vanguard at them, and with the wounding on 4s thing, you know, automatic wounding on 4s thing, and did like 1 wound, maybe 2. It was nothing. So what I realised is that, you know, Bullgryn, you know, are actually, they're really good at absorbing small arms. Really, really good at small arms. Because even if the Lucius player puts AP -1 on those radiant covers, you don't care because you put take cover, you summon a 2-up. You know, and like even if he does like 30 automatic wounds to you, bear in mind he has to be able to see with all of them, and that's not easy in the days of this tricksy terrain that we play on. Even if he does like 30 wounds to you, he'll get like 5 unsafe wounds to you. It's like a Bullgryn and a bit dead. That's nothing. If you have a full Bullgryn blob and they absorb that, they are going to beat the crap out of those Skitarii when they get the charge off. So yeah, really interesting. So unfortunately, I lost it. Turn 1. I did manage to scrape together quite a few points, and the end score was like basically 90 to my opponent, but I had still managed to get like 50 points, which was quite respectable. But because it was based on point differential, I ended up getting no tournament points, which was a real shame because I actually worked really hard to get those 50 points, and it did feel felt a little funny. I was like, well, what's the point when you're so far? Yeah, what's the point? Anyway, couple of highlights of the game though. Like I said, the Bullgryns really could absorb Skitarii Vanguard damage, no problem. And a point that really made it obvious to me that if you're going to play Skitarii and if you're going to play against Skitarii and you're going to use Scions, the point that really hammered home to me that why playing cagey would have been better was when a single Taurox Prime, when my opponent hadn't got any of his defensive buffs off, a single Taurox Prime, the one that hadn't been blown up, killed like 12 Skitarii on its own. And what I realised was, and this is something I meant, you know, this is hinting back to what I talked about at the beginning, is if I hadn't taken Valkyries and I hadn't taken Bullgryn, and I had basically just spammed Plasma and Taurox Primes, Lambdan Lions, I think I could have won that game. Because there was enough line of sight blocking terrain that he wouldn't have got any shots on me turn 1 if I didn't want him to. I could have literally, my turn 1, you know what, I'll just wait out. You know, you can teleport a unit over, I don't care, I'll screen you out with something. And I could have literally killed nothing my turn 1, let him, you know, if I'd gone first, he's going to pop his Doctrine Imperator, he's going to have his extra armor save. I let him waste it. And then turn 2, when he's like all moving out and exposed, the Taurox come out and I gun down all the Skitarii in one turn, and I start blowing up. And turn 2, my drops start coming in. I start blowing up all his large chickens because I've got Elimination Protocol Sanction, so I can get full rerolls against them. I honestly think that if I had taken Scions and spammed Taurox Primes and Plasma and and Scion Infantry, and not messed around with the Valkyries or the Bullgryns, which are fun units, but I'm still not entirely certain on their tactical usefulness, I think I would have won that game. And what I realised in that game was, and this is what I mentioned, well, you know what, I'll come back to that at the end of game summary, okay? But the Bullgryns fell apart against the AdMech, the Valkyries weren't any good against the AdMech, and I have a very strong feeling it would have been a very similar encounter, a very similar result, and those units would have struggled similarly if I had faced Dark Elder as well. So there's something about those units, which we'll talk about more later, where they do provide tactical depth until you come across one of the top dog armies. And then you're kind of better just spamming stuff. Anyway, we'll come back to that a little bit later on, but that's most of what I wanted to say about that. So unfortunately, game 2 was a loss. But it was my first game against the AdMech. I would rather lose in a slightly more casual 1-dayer than lose in a 2-dayer where I might be taking things a bit more seriously. And I can tell you now that next time I face AdMech, and if people want to take, there's lists out, there's people talking about drop all the planes and just take like 200 Skitarii, and I know top tier players who are going down that route, and all I can say is I hope they do. Because if they turn up with 200 Skitarii, and I'm running my 8 Taurox Prime list, it's going to be, I'm going to use some bad language now, cover your children's ears. Okay, hope they're covered. It's going to be a fucking wood chipper if they turn up with a Skitarii infantry army and I've got my Lambdan Lion army. Okay? Because like I said, 1 Taurox Prime on its own could kill one of those blocks. 2 would massacre, could kill half of those blocks. 2 will kill a block. If I'd had 6 Taurox Primes, I would have killed all his Skitarii in turn 1. At that point, his large chickens can do what they want because my infantry is going to deal with his large chickens in turn 2, turn 3. So, anyway. Tough game, turn 2. Lessons learned. Learn from my mistakes. If you're going to face AdMech, play it cagey until they've popped their buffs. But anyway, without further ado, let's get on to the final game of the tournament, which was a very fun game and probably my favourite game of the entire tournament, which was against the Tyranids. Bug! So, third game of the tournament, and it's against Tyranids. And it's against a player that I've played against before called Joe. Absolutely fantastic guy. He plays Tyranids, he plays Chaos. That tells you all you need to know about him. He's in this hobby for the right reasons. But don't you underestimate Joe, because I have never beaten him. Okay? He's beaten me with Flyerants, he's beaten me with Invisible Demon Stars, with Screamer Stars. I've never beaten him. So a little bit of a grudge match this time, but the other way around, because I wanted to beat Joe, obviously, because I've never managed to beat him before. But he's an absolutely fantastic player, and he gets most sporting. I think he must have a dozen, I kid you not, no exaggeration, a dozen most sporting trophies under his belt. So super nice guy, into the hobby for all the right reasons, and an absolute pleasure to play against. And it was definitely my favourite. My favourite game of the tournament. And so he was running a bit of a monster mash list. He had 3 Tyrannofexes with acid spray. He had a barbed Hiradul, which is like, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's a big Forge World shooty monster. He had Hive Guard. He had a big block of Tyranid warriors, 2 Morlocks, and then some deep strikers like Raveners and Lictors. And he had a couple of Pyrovores as well. You might think Pyrovores are rubbish, but they're actually good for doing Rod, which is great. And he also had a Malanthrope to give his artillery bugs, his big bugs, a -1 to hit bubble from shooting. So that was really, really cool. So going into this game, I actually thought I had a really good chance because I had access to the Order Elimination Protocol Sanctioned, which is, for those that don't know, is a Scion-specific order, which means you can get full rerolls to wounds against vehicles and monsters. And the big part of Joe's list was his 6 monsters, his Morlocks, his Tyrannofexes, his big Forge World bug. So, yeah, I thought I had a pretty good chance. And so we deployed, and I deployed my normal formation, Tauroxes and stuff out of line of sight, Valkyries, as far back as possible. And I got turn 1 again. I went first every game this tournament, which was really good. And I thought, you know what? Again, this is very similar to the Sisters game. Now, whilst Joe has a lot of firepower, it's all like 18-inch range. And weirdly, my Taurox Primes are actually in a good position to win the long-range game, which is weird because normally they're like close-range, mid-range brawlers. So I realised that I could sort of do the same tactic that I'd done with the Sisters. And so at first I was playing it cagey. I thought, you know what, I don't want to let him just acid spray me. And then I realised that unless I just wanted to sit exactly where I was, I wouldn't be able to avoid his artillery, because it's an 18-inch range plus a 6-inch move from his big bugs. And I thought, you know what? Okay, what I'll do is I'll play it cagey a bit, but I'll set the tone for the game. And so I flung one of my Valkyries forward, dropped out the 10-man Scions Squad with 4 Melta guns, with the Lord Commissar who can issue an order, and I was like, bring that big bug down. And I got, with a reroll to hit, I got all my Melta guns on target. Precision drops was in Melta range. I was able to wound with all my Melta guns, which was really, really good. And then it was like, Joe was like, okay, well, I'm Yormander, blah, blah, blah. I'll get like a 6-up save against this, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, no, you won't. I'm AP -5. He was like, oh, okay then. Straight through his armor. And I did 6d6 plus 8 damage to a Tyrannifex. Sorry, 4d6 plus 8 damage to a Tyrannifex, because all the metals were in Melta range. I did something crazy, like 27 damage or something to this Tyrannifex. It was in the 20s. You know, it was a lot of damage. And this thing was died. And it was the only one that wasn't in range of the Malanthrope, in case you're wondering how I managed to hit, you know, with the Meltas so reliably. And it was like, okay, I've just eliminated like 25% of his long-range firepower. And that's pretty much all I did my turn 1. The Valkyries have, you know, killed a couple of Tyranid warriors and whatnot, but that was it. And then, you know, his turn 2, his turn 1, he doesn't get a lot of, you know, he kills, he damages the Valkyries. But what was really interesting is the acid spray is only like strength 7. And so he acid sprays with his 2 remaining Tyrannifexes, one of the Valkyries, and does an alright amount of damage, but, you know, I'm for 7, and he has to move a bit so he doesn't get all of his shots. So one of the Valkyries lives on like low wounds at first, and then he does try and kill the other Valkyrie, but ends up only doing like 6 damage to it, which isn't enough to degrade it. And he ends up having to he has to use his Hive Guard, firing twice to finish off the Valkyrie that had gone straight down his gullet. And so it's like, okay, so his firepower is good, but it's not that good. And he's moved his Barbed Hero Duel forward, and I'd moved my Bullgryns forward behind Lines That Block in my turn 1. So I'm like, okay, I'm in a position here to really, really hurt his shooting. Really, really hurt his army. And so what I did is I had moved, I basically had one Taurox Prime that was holding one of the flanks. I had seeded one of the flanks to his like warrior blob and whatnot. I was fine with doing that. And so I was like, you know, I'll just get engage and stuff from like dropping units in and stuff like that, and with my Valkyries here and there and stuff. And I'll just, you know, again, I'll just use my maneuverability to keep my opponent at arm's length. And so I dropped the other Valkyrie into hover mode, even though it still had the Melta troops inside. And I was like, you know what? I want to kill that Barbed Hero Duel in 1 turn. Because I had denied it getting a 5+ Feel No Pain. He tried to put Catalyst on it, and I denied it. Really, even with a reroll, even my opponent had a reroll, he still didn't do very well on the casting, and I just straight up denied it with my Inquisitor. Which was so good, because my Inquisitor hadn't done much all time. He does a few mortal wounds and whatnot, but he really shined in this game. And then it was like, okay, Plasma guys jump out, and my Melta guys in the Valkyrie jumped out and just got into normal range, not Melta range. And between them and the Plasma guys mostly stayed inside, to be honest, this turn. But between the Melta guys and the Valkyries and you know, a little bit of the firepower here and there, some mortal wounds from the Inquisitor, I actually got the Barbed Hero Duel down by like half wounds. And then I charged a full Bullgryn Bomb into it. Charged a full blob into it. And I used the stratagem, which for each Bullgryn that makes the charge on like a 4+ to do a mortal wound. I did 4 mortal wounds to him. So now this thing is sitting on like 5 wounds, I think. or 4 wounds even. And then the Bullgryns just go to town with their Mauls, and they're damaged 2 Mauls. And even though I'm wounding on 5s, I get like 13 wounds on this beast, and I just kill it. Even if it's on like a 2-up save, but then it's on a 3-up save because of 8-1 on the Mauls, and I just kill it. And it's like, okay, I've basically taken no damage this turn. Yeah, on my army. I've just like a Valkyrie and a squad, essentially. And in 2 turns, I have killed a Tyrannofex and a big beast. And my Taurox Primes had started doing some long-range Daka onto his warrior squad, which he was forced to camp on an objective to stop me getting like max primary every turn. And again, they were like a long way away, and so I could just keep manoeuvring around them. And when I was shooting at them, I was shooting them up really on the very edge of like my 24-inch range. So then like turn 3 comes around, and it's like, alright, I'm going to kill another big bug. I said, that's what I'm going to do. So my opponent's turn 2, he puts everything into the Bullgryn and manages to, it comes down to the last wound in the combat phase of this Broodlord, but he does manage to kill the Bullgryn. Then it's like, okay, so you've killed the Bullgryn, but that took your entire army. Turn 3 comes around, I kill the Tyrannofex. I kill, because all my plasma comes out to play this time. All my plasma comes out to play, and I kill his second Tyrannofex with my plasma, and I kill his Broodlord, and I really whittle the warriors down to like 3 at this point. And my opponent has brought. My opponent didn't bring his reserves in turn 2. I don't know if he forgot, but he did forget to bring them in. He didn't bring them in. Anyway, turn 3 for my opponent goes around, all his reserves come in. He starts getting line breaker left, right and centre. But his reserves, one of them has to do Rod, which is the Raveners. And the Morlocks can't charge turn they come in. So whilst they come in and do a bunch of mortal wounds, it's like, alright, I don't really care. Morlocks are really not that tough to kill. They're only tough to 6, they've only got 12 wounds, and they don't have an invulnerable save. So, honestly, with my plasma squads, which had killed the Tyrannofex, which hadn't really been damaged by his firepower all that much. He had killed lots of the riflemen, but a lot of the plasma guys were left alive. They had taken some casualties, but there's a lot of plasma left there. And so it was like 2 plasma squads with reroll 1s to hit and 4 rerolls to wound. That kills a Morlock. Do the same to another Morlock. The Valkyrie comes back and starts dealing with like the Raveners, and I just had maneuverability, I just had firepower. And the Melta squad, which are the ones that had actually jumped out of the Valkyrie turn 2 and was somehow still alive, ended up being really lucky and just ace the Tyrannofex, 4 Melta guns. I say really lucky. I think at that point I'd kind of realised that 4 Melta guns and a plasma pistol and a few crack grenades could basically kill a Tyrannofex. And so they did that again. And it was just like, end of turn 4, my opponent had no big bugs left. I had actually managed to tag his Hive Guard in combat with one of my squads that had dropped down to do Rod, and he hadn't killed them, so I tagged him in combat. So my opponent looked at his turn 4 and was like, tried to do some stuff, but then he was like, we even had half an hour left on the clock, and my opponent was like, look, I can't win this. I have left on the board like a Lictor, some Hive Guard that are tied up in combat, and a Malanthrope and a Pyrovore, basically. That's what I've got left, and you've still got 3 Taurox Primes, a Valkyrie, and like 20 infantry, 25 infantry. I cannot win. I just can't do it. And I was like, fair enough, man. If you don't want to play it out, totally get it. We've still got a bit of time left on the clock, but why don't we get some time back from our lives? So we sat down and just had a chat about the game and whatnot. It was a really nice, relaxing end to the tournament. But yeah, so that was it. Another win in the bag. Final score was something like 91 points to the Scions, 78 to the Nids. Even though Joe didn't have much left on the board, he had done a really good job of scoring stuff. So yeah, really interesting last game. Very fun. Scions, really punched hard. But let's do an end of tournament wrap up now. Let's wrap it all up. So that was it. We came, we saw, and we kind of conquered. We went 2-1, 2 wins, 1 loss, taking a pretty much pure Scion army to a fairly competitive event. I mean, I took on the new AdMech, Lucius, and if I hadn't played like an absolute idiot, and maybe my list was slightly different, I truly believe I would have had a good chance of winning that game. I do, and I'm not just saying that, I do believe that. I took on the new Sisters. I took on Bloody Rose Sisters with the new Codex, with all the current hot favourite units in that deck. You know, 20-man Sister Blob, Sacrosanct, Val, Zephyrin, Repentia. I took that on, and I smashed it. And I took on a Tyranid list that, you know, sure, Tyranids aren't that competitive at the moment, but they're more competitive than regular Guard, right? And I took it on, and again, I smashed it. And so I really got a great feeling using the Scions. I've said it before and I'll say it again. It kind of feels like running Dark Elder Light. They feel like a poor man's Dark Elder. But that's not that sounds derogatory, and it's not. They just feel fast, maneuverable. They sweep around the board. Nothing is out of reach. You don't need move to get places. You can just get where you want to go and not worry about it. Okay? And you have such firepower. Even against AdMech, when my firepower was greatly diminished, I could still make my opponent's eyebrow raise. When that single Taurox Prime deleted half a block of his Skitarii, basically unsupported, you know, when his planes were flying around, bombing the crap out of me, and I took like 2 or 3 of them out, I can't remember. In one turn, I took out 2 planes in one turn with barely any forces. They had power. So I really do feel like Scions are genuinely a competitive choice. They are going to be my go-to competitive army now. You know, they are. I see them as my competitive Guard force. I'm going to get more Taurox Primes. I'm going to be tweaking the list. I'm going to be playing out. What did I think of the list overall? I thought that it was good. It could operate in every single phase. But this is what I mentioned sort of partway through the video. There were a couple of things that made me realise that there were a couple of funny units, should we say. So the Valkyries and the Bullgryns, in the game against the Sisters and the game against the Tyranids, those units were invaluable. So useful. They got me around the board, they got me into commanding positions on turn 1, they helped me nuke something turn 1 if I wanted to in that third game. But the moment that I played against a top dog, a top army, the moment I played against AdMech, both of those units couldn't keep up. You know, the Valkyrie, the AdMech was able to screen it out, and the Valkyries at max AP -1 really, you know, struggled. And the Bullgryn got obliterated before they could do anything because they're quite a slow unit. And the funny thing is that I feel the exact same thing, I would have felt exactly the same way about those units had I taken on the other top dog army at the moment, which is Dark Elder. And so what I kind of realised about the list was, if, you know, but, when I played against like Tyranids, for example, those units, both of them, pulled their weight. And when I played against Sisters, both those units, at the very least, didn't let me down. And Sisters are a sort of solid, balanced 9th edition codex. And so what I've kind of realised is, when you are, you know, those units, they almost have like a peak. If you imagine like a graph, they're really competitive and they're high up on that peak. But the moment they come across something top, they just plummet. Now the AdMech had no problem with dealing with my Bullgryns. No problem screening out my Valks. No problems with it whatsoever. And so I kind of feel like what's interesting is that if I had dropped those Valkyries, if I had dropped those Bullgryns, and instead had taken more Taurox Primes with more infantry inside them, that I would have actually performed just as well against the Sisters. And I would have, because my Taurox Primes were the unit of the match in that game. In fact, were probably the unit of the match nearly every game. And if I had more of those against the AdMech, I genuinely think I could have had them. I genuinely believe that. Once their toughness buffs were gone, they weren't in that defender protocol, whatever it is. You know, I just know it. So what's interesting is that, like, if I was just to build my list to take on the top stuff, I reckon that Scions could do it. I reckon Scions could be considered really, really powerful. Top tier, S tier, I don't know. But at the very least, I know that I could go into those games and I reckon I'd have a pretty good chance. Of course, I'll have to play them and I'll have to report back from the front line. Now, a couple of other things to mention, because I know this video has gone on a while already. Another big question that some people are going to be saying is, well, what do you think's better, your pure infantry guard or your Scions? Now, the armies play very differently. I'm not going to give you a wishy-washy answer, but let me just give a little bit of context. The armies play very differently. Pure infantry guard does feel like a bit of a slog and a bit of a grind, but that's kind of the way it's meant to feel. You're throwing waves upon waves of infantry at the enemy. You are going to win on sort of primary, and you're going to try and deny them what secondaries you can. And there's a great feeling of satisfaction and awesomeness when the humble guardsman with the bayonet and balls is able to pull a win out against a top tier army. There is definitely a, sorry EA, but definitely a sense of pride and accomplishment. However, Scions, you don't feel like you're having to overwhelm and fight against the odds. You just feel in charge. You just feel powerful. Your units kill stuff. They can move. They can shoot. They can operate in all the different phases. They've got a stratagem for every eventuality. You want some mortal wounds? Boom, gives the Mechanicus. You want to up the strength of those weapons? Boom, full charge. You want to slow down the enemy's movement? Boom, hammerfall. You want to be able to drop in Melta range? You got precision drop. You've got down descent. Obviously, you can use down descent if you're on Gorgons, but anyway. So Scions play differently, and the best way to sum it up would be that pure infantry feels heroic, but Scions feel cool and calm and operator. And to give you a definitive answer, I would probably say on balance that I think that Scions would be more competitive, or are more competitive, than my guard. If you look at the results alone, I went 1-1-1 with pure infantry guard, I went 2-1 with Scions. Now, if I'd taken my Scions into that previous event and taken on Death Guard and Dark Elder and Dark Angels, what do I think I would have got? I think I would have gone 2-1. I think I would have beaten Death Guard because of Vengeance for Cadia, and combined that with Gifts from Mechanicus, a horrendous amount of, I could have deleted Death Drive Terminators, no problem. The amount of firepower that Scions can put out, I'm confident I could have deleted Death Guard without much worry. Against the Dark Angels, again, I think it's Scions, one of the few armies that could actually kill the unkillable Dark Angels list. And against Dark Elder, I think I would have had a better chance. But Dark Elder's Dark Elder, I'm not going to say I would have beaten them, but I definitely think I could have gone 2-1. So I think Scions are more competitive, and there's a number of reasons. One, like I said, I feel they play 9th edition better. They're elite, they have firepower, they've got manoeuvrability, and they can play objectives. That's what you need to do in 9th edition. They can score and they can kill. Pure Infantry Guard just kind of overwhelms the system that is 9th edition and somehow breaks the game and wins it, but it's not the same. The other reason, I think, that makes Scions more competitive is more of a soft reason. Okay? They're so much easier logistically. I had plenty of time to think and move and do my game properly with Scions, because there was just less models, less moving parts. More complicated army, but weirdly less moving parts. So at no point was I rushing for time. I was able to do what I needed to do to win the games. I often so that's it. I would say if there's something that if both armies are relatively equal in power but play differently, although I would say Scions are probably slightly more powerful, the thing that really tips the scales in the Scions' favour is in terms of tournament play. We're talking real world. They're easier. They're easier to put together an army. You just start collecting sets over and over again. And they're easier to pilot because there's not as much going on. It's a smaller army. And that is a very, it's not really like a gameplay benefit, but it certainly is, and it cannot be overstated, a factor you want to consider when you're taking an army to a tournament. So how did I finally place? So I've left this bit to the very end because it is a very slight criticism of the way the tournament worked. And I mentioned this at the beginning about point differential. So despite the fact that I had 2 strong wins, 90 plus points, and the fact that I had a 50 points even in my loss, I placed only, and I'm a little disappointed, or disappointed is not the right word, lower than expected. I only placed 14th out of 36 players. And the reason for that was my last game against the Tyranids, my opponent scored scored some points. He did okay. So the point differential wasn't massive. So I only ended up walking away with like 31 tournament points. It wasn't that big. And what I sorted out didn't affect my ranking whatsoever, to be absolutely clear. It didn't affect my ranking. But I noticed that a couple of other people's rankings in the tournament, there were people that won less games but placed higher. So I think there was someone in like the top 8 of the event who only won, or was it top 4 or something crazy, who only won 2 out of 3 games, and someone below him had won 3 out of 3 games. But because of the point differential, the person that won 3 games actually scored lower than the guy that had won, had lost a game. And that didn't feel right. If you lose a game, you shouldn't be, someone else won all of their games. It didn't feel right to me. Like, it didn't affect my ranking in some ways, but I feel like it did overall probably affect my ranking because, yeah, I had one game. It feels like, I don't know, you have to be ruthless. The list that won the tournament was AdMech, and it didn't play the mission, but it tabled every opponent in 2 turns. And that feels wrong. 9th edition is about playing the mission. And if the best way to win a point differential tournament is to not play the mission, but just to delete everything, that doesn't feel right. So that would be my very small criticism of the event, and that's why I've left it to the very end of the video. If Matt and Stu, you end up watching this video, please don't take it to heart. The event was super well run, super organised, loved it. I'm still happy that I placed in the top half. I want to be absolutely clear about that, but it was just a tiny speck of dirt in the ointment. And yeah, I just thought it was a bit unusual. That was all. It's an old school way of doing it. It's an old school way, but personally, I much prefer you just go off wins and losses and then you look at pure tournament score for tiebreaker. That's it. I think that's it. I think that works better. And I think it just makes sense to my brain. Anyway, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. I know it's a bit of a longer one. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. If you have enjoyed this video, please consider heading on over to the Patreon page. There will be a link down in the description below. If it wasn't for the support of my genuinely awesome Patreon supporters, I wouldn't be able to go to these events. I wouldn't be able to afford the money for the tickets, for the hotels, for the travel, all that kind of stuff. I wouldn't be able to put the armies together, So huge thank you to my Patreon supporters. You guys genuinely help me keep my channel on the cutting edge. And your generosity is just generally very awesome. So if you are interested in becoming a Patreon supporter, you want to see me go to more events, please consider heading on over. I keep it really simple. I don't have tiers or layers or anything like that. I just say, look, you give me $1, you give me $20. I'm super grateful no matter what. And I'm super transparent with it as well. All the money gets reinvested straight back into the channel. Goes into models, goes into painting, goes into tournaments, all that kind of stuff. Anyway. Massive thank you to the Patreon supporters. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. And of course, I'll see you guys next time.